1 2 2 2 1 2. Hey 1 2 2 2 1 2 1 2 1 2. Well, good afternoon, everyone. This event is part of the Melbourne Conversations event series run by the City of Melbourne. We'll be taking questions at the end of this event for everyone here in the audience. For our online audience, you can submit your questions on YouTube chat or email them to conversations@melbourne.vic.gov.au. And if you're watching at home, you can also subscribe to this Melbourne Knowledge Week YouTube channel to stay up to date with Melbourne Conversations events. So for those of you in the audience, if you haven't already done so, please check in via the QR codes up on the walls here. We do want to run a COVID-safe event, and I know most of you have done that already. The City of Melbourne respectfully acknowledges the traditional custodians of the land, the Bunurong, Bunwurrong and Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung peoples of the Eastern Kulin Nations. We pay our respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. We're committed to our reconciliation journey because at its heart, reconciliation is about strengthening relationships between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal peoples for the benefit of all Victorians. My name is Andrew Weir. I'm the Director of Economic Development International here at the City of Melbourne. And with us today, we've got a fantastic panel. We've got a fantastic conversation about the future of the Melbourne economy. How well are we going on the back end of COVID-19? And what does our future look like? We've got, joining us today on our panel, we have three speakers. We've got Sharon Hamilton, CEO of Fella Hamilton, a fashion retailer here in Melbourne. So welcome, Sharon. We've got Associate Professor Janine Dixon, economist at the Centre of Policy Studies at Victoria University. And we have Paul Guerra, CEO of the Victorian Chamber of Commerce and Industry. So welcome to you all.
Good to see you, Andrew.
Thank you.
Yes. So we'll start off with our first question. I guess it's a temperature check. How do you feel about how the Victorian economy is going? How is your industry faring? How is the economy as a whole going in your assessment? We might start off with you, Paul, actually. You're from the Victorian Chamber of Commerce and Industry. You represent a huge range of employers across the city. So how are things going at the moment?
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. I think we should be optimistic about how the economy is sitting right now, and the figures released by the Federal Treasurer last week showed that as well. So we had really good growth in the last 2 quarters of last year. We had double-digit growths in Victoria in the last quarter as well. So the signs are positive in terms of where we're moving to. That doesn't remove the fact that last year was difficult and it challenged us in so many ways. The 2 lockdowns really threw the economy, really threw confidence as well. And the 5-day lockdown that we had not long back didn't help that either. But we're starting to move out of it, starting to have some confidence. It's going to rely on some certainty. And that certainty around never closing business again will be paramount to the economy to continue and to take up. When I look across the board, there's probably 5 sectors that will need ongoing support, and that's largely because they rely on international visitors. And those 5 sectors, or the vaccine being rolled out at speed. So those 5 sectors are tourism, and we've just heard the Prime Minister announce some support for tourism. There's the events sector, which has struggled, and it's great to see this event pop up here. There's the arts and entertainment that rely on people coming in. There's some parts of hospitality, and certainly that part is where the city is hurt the most. And then the last part is the universities that rely on international students. They've hurt as well. Outside of that, the economy is actually going really well, and actually has gone pretty well through the last 12 months as well.
Great. Just a follow-up question to that, Paul. Given we're here at the City of Melbourne, in the centre of Greater Melbourne, we're probably one of the more impacted parts of the Australian economy. How do you see the central city going at the moment?
Yeah, but not one of the most, I think the most impacted city in Australia right now. So, put it in perspective, you wouldn't want to be anywhere other than Australia right now. That second lockdown, which extended for over 100 days, really hurt the city economy, and we're just starting to see it bounce back now. There's more people in the city today than what there was last week, and we hope that will build. The voucher scheme announced by the state government that goes live tomorrow, so get online 10 o'clock tomorrow and get your $200 voucher. The footy coming back, sport coming back, Other events coming back will drive that. But ultimately, it's going to be choice of people to come back into the city that's going to do that. As employers in the city, we have to encourage that, and we want to encourage that. But it's up to all of us beyond the city of Melbourne to make that decision to come back into the city and experience what we missed out on.
Yeah. Thanks, Paul. Sharon, perhaps you could tell us a little bit about your story, about Fella Hamilton's story, and how your business has experienced the last 12 months and how things are faring now.
When the pandemic hit, we actually didn't know what's going to happen, the uncertainty. And we didn't know, do we stop production? We manufacture as well as retail. We have 34 retail stores across Australia. And we were a bit in panic mode. You know, those first few days, it's sort of days we'll never forget. And it wasn't until a few friends came to us and said, look, we're doctors, we're really worried about wearing normal clothes to work. We've been recommended that you should be wearing scrubs or gowns. Can you make us something? Because we are very agile and we're a vertical organisation, we were able to cut, make, design, and it snowballed from there. So it wasn't just ladies' fashion we were then designing. We started a new range called Fella Healthwear, and it grew and grew, and we got lots of orders for scrubs and gowns, and today we still keep that range, and we only want to strengthen that. So it was actually, it sounds terrible, but it was a very exciting time with the team. They were very, very embraced in making this range that they never knew anything about scrubs and gowns. We make ladies' clothes, tops, pants. So that was quite different. But it was a positive thing for us. We kept all our workforce in the factory right through. In fact, we had to employ a few people when masks became mandatory just to keep up with the
That's all right.
with the capacity to pick and pack. But the retail stores, unfortunately, they suffered as well.
Thank you. And Janine, from your perspective at Victoria University and the Centre of Policy Studies, can you give us your take on how you think the economy is performing, and in particular what it means for Melbourne?
Yeah, so is this on? Yeah. So 2020 was obviously a very difficult year for the economy and for the Victorian economy in particular, because we endured those two very long and difficult lockdowns. But I think there was a lot positive to take from that. Particularly, I think we saw the resilience and the agility of Victorian businesses. The story that Sharon's just told about how she was able to pivot her business towards doing something else very quickly. I probably, like many of you, I spent most of the year sitting in the spare room at my house in the suburbs. Another thing that was quite apparent was that suburban cafes, suburban takeaways and so forth were doing pretty well. Now, in the last few weeks, many of us have made our way back into the city, and you only need to look around to see empty shop fronts. The city did not fare well relative to the suburbs. So that was a difficult time for Melbourne. From the perspective of the university where I work, the impacts are going to have a long tail, right? Because I think, Melbourne, we're pretty well on top of COVID. We may have short-run stoppages that certainly disrupt our lives, but we're pretty well on top of COVID and back to life as COVID normal. Vaccinations are on their way, so that's all fairly optimistic. The problem is the rest of the world's not really there yet. And our university sector in particular relies on international students, and that's particularly a Victorian problem. So in Australia, around 1 in 3 students come from overseas. In Victoria, it's over 40%. That's going to have a long tail. So last year, the university sector, according to data from the Department of Education, employment sort of grew as normal by a couple of percent, which has been pretty normal over the last decade. But we may yet see the university sector shedding jobs going forward, just as the rest of the economy is hopefully starting to pick up.
Thanks, Janine. So if you've just joined us, my name's Andrew Weir. I'm from the City of Melbourne, and you are watching Melbourne Conversations, looking up after lockdown as part of the Melbourne Conversations series run by the City of Melbourne. If you do have a question, we'll be taking questions from the audience here in Little Collins Street at the end of the session, or online via YouTube chat or email conversations@melbourne.vic.gov.au. We'll be covering off a couple of different time horizons in this conversation, but including the short-term and the longer-term recovery journey. But maybe we'll start off in the short term. Over the next 12 months, what are we going to need to do as a city to get back to firing on all cylinders again? Paul, maybe start with you.
Yeah, so the first part there is get our confidence back, right? And that comes with certainty. So if there's certainty around safety, if there's certainty around the containment of the virus, if there's certainty around people coming back into the state without carrying the virus outside of quarantine, and importantly, if there's certainty around the vaccine rollout, then that gives us confidence. And then as we get confidence, we then venture out of the purview that we've been operating in the next 12 months. The other part I'd say is don't be scared of change. Right? The city probably doesn't come back in the short term in the same way it was 12 months ago, but come back it will. We've seen the city change over a period of time, and that's our to do over the next 12 months is if we're operating in an office space at 60% capacity every day, what do we do with the other 40%? What happens with some of the shop fronts that rely on the spill of incidental traffic through the day? How do we stimulate different aspects of people coming in? If I look back 20 years, right, the cycle of change is probably repeating itself. And I go back there because one of the city's great employees along the way has been Professor Rob Adams. And Rob was responsible for Postcode 3000, which saw an injection of livability into the city. So we saw people starting to live in the city for probably the first time. That's the type of imagination that we actually need to see in terms of where does the city go next. It will change, it should change, it's actually been changing anyway, and we shouldn't be scared of that change. But it can only happen once we get the confidence that we can go back to a normal type life.
Yeah, thanks. And Sharon, what do we need to do to get the retail sector back up and running again, do you think?
That's a very good question, but I'll just expand on Paul's discussion is you need the people back in the city, because if they're not walking past the shop front, can't even see it, and there's no point having retail presence paying high rents when there's no one in the city. So I agree, it's really getting bodies back into office buildings. I mean, where at the moment there might be only a few levels. We need to get more different companies who normally maybe couldn't afford to be centrally based. We may attract, the inner city may attract a broader range of companies that can take some of the levels. And as I said, it'll be a changed landscape, but retail really needs people here. So that's we need to drive people into the city. Look, incentives like free parking, they're always good and handy. Because a lot of our customers would say parking's number one if I can't park. I mean, that's if they're not using public transport. But yes, that's along the same line. Retail can't survive on high rents when no one's around.
And Janine, have you got any thoughts on what we need to do over the next 12 months?
Yeah, so I think the priority over the next 12 months is absolutely addressing the virus. So that means continuing with our containment of the virus as best we can, and of course embracing the vaccine. So those two must be the first priority for the next 12 months. We'll get nowhere while we still have this virus around us. The next priority then is, I think, a revival more generally in household spending. Through the pandemic year, a lot of stimulus money went from the government into the household sector, and a lot of that was saved. There was nothing to buy. There was no fun to be had. So a lot of that was saved, and that's got to start coming out, right? So the household sector needs to start having the confidence that it can spend that money. So partly it's saved just because there was nothing to buy, and partly it's saved because people are worried. So I think as we address the pandemic, as we address with the vaccination and the confidence that we will get through it, we'll get the household sector out spending again. As for the city itself, I think the city will face a more difficult challenge, because I think one thing that we've learnt during the pandemic is that we can work at home. So the city will lose some of that sort of foot traffic that comes with the office workers just out on their lunch breaks. That doesn't mean to say that nobody's coming to the city anymore, but we may need to adjust to that lower level of foot traffic. And I think the retailers that are ahead of the curve on that will be the ones that do well.
Sharon?
Just one other thing. We want our interstate tourists coming into the city. So I think with less border issues and more reliability, that when they go back home they won't have to isolate again. Once we're over that phase, that hurt that people were stuck in Byron Bay or wherever they were stuck, I think we're going to find a lot more people actually visiting the city of Melbourne. I mean, we've got so much to offer here. It's such a beautiful city that that tourist sector is also very important.
Yeah, Sharon,
domestic sector.
That's really important around the certainty of borders staying open. Right?
Yes.
We're one Australia. We have to get back to a position where we know we can travel between states without fear of being locked out. I've spoken to too many people over the past couple of weeks that have come down from Sydney that have driven down, and they've driven down because they're worried about being locked out of their own state again should Victoria pull the trigger and lock the state down. That's not good for confidence, right? And we need certainty around that.
Janine?
Yeah, just a word on tourism. I know we can't travel, but I think we've become really good at holidaying at home. So the staycation, we've really embraced the staycation. Internationally, Australians, as a matter of course, holiday overseas more than what overseas people holiday here, right? So closing those borders has kept Australians at home and holidaying at home. So it's not all doom and gloom there. And I think we need to maybe change the offerings of what the city has to cater more towards our population of Melbourne.
Well, there are certainly lots of available hotel rooms in the city of Melbourne, and I'm sure you can get a great deal on a staycation here in the city of Melbourne if you were after one, and maybe using one of those $200 state government vouchers to come and spend a couple of nights in the city and go out for dinner is certainly what I'd be encouraging people to think about. But let's change gears a little bit. We're focused on the next 12 months, but recovery is going to be a long journey. It's not going to be something we finish over the next 12 months. It's going to take many years. So let's fast forward a little bit in your minds. It's now 2030. The economy is booming. Melbourne's economy is once again one of the great economic centres of Australia, if not the world. What did we need to do in 2021 to help us get there? Paul?
Yeah, so the first thing is Saturday, 12 months ago, so we say that again, Saturday 12 months ago was probably the first time most of us took COVID-19 seriously. And we did it because the Grand Prix was cancelled Saturday 12 months ago, right? In the lead up to it, we'd heard this thing called COVID. We probably didn't pay too much attention to it. And then, bang, the event city cancelled one of its biggest events. And then from there, we progressed into lockdown. Now, prior to Saturday 12 months ago, we'd had 28 years of growth as a country. Right? That stopped, and gee, did it stop in a big hurry. So there's a reset that needs to occur here in terms of where do we go and how do we go there. Sharon's already talked about the reason she got through it and the business got through it is they stopped and said, what do we need to do? That's called planning. That's called understanding that the market that you had is about to change. And my recommendation is every business actually needs to do that right now, because the 28 years of growth stopped in a hurry. We may get growth again this year, we may not. The right planning will ensure we do. What we then need to do is capitalise on the strengths that we have both as a city and as a state. What are we truly global lead at, and where can we truly global lead? So you'll hear more, the Herald Sun's come online, about a concept called the Victoria Summit, which is doing exactly that. Where will Victoria dominate in the next decade, 2 decades, and then 3 decades? It's the bright minds of the state coming together to say, hey, Where can we do this? Building off the work that the state government's done over a number of years to put a series of actions together that can be presented back to both state and federal governments. It won't be a closed shop. Everybody's invited to attend, because we want to make sure that we do get those bright minds, that we do get those ideas, so that we can truly position Victoria, which will result in Melbourne becoming a global leader in so many different areas. I'd argue we're a global leader in events and hospitality, right? We want to add to that. What else can we add to that?
So, Paul, just on that, Melbourne's economy has been driven a lot by population. It's been driven by 1 million people a day coming into the central city. It's been driven by movement of people from around the world into Melbourne through tourism or international education. It's been driven by population growth of in the city of Melbourne more than 3% a year. If we can't rely on population growth, and if we can't rely on movement of people, what's going to be the driver of our economy?
So why can't we rely on that? Okay, it may not be there for the next 12 months, but once we get certainty of people coming back in with the vaccine having rolled out and quarantine being done, there's no better place in the world right now than Australia. It's why it was so important for those pictures of the tennis being beamed to the rest of the world, to show the rest of the world that actually we can do it, and we can do it with crowds. So it may not be in the next 12 months, but there's no reason we can't go back to where we were in terms of growth. We were the most livable city for 7, 8, however many years it was. We're second or third now. We can reclaim that. And it's actually one of the themes of the Victoria Summit, is to look at that community, that well-being, that livability that has made Melbourne so attractive. How do we regain? In fact, how do we build on that again?
Sharon.
I definitely agree we're one of the most livable cities in the world. We have to travel quite a lot to different parts of the world normally. And when we ever come back to Melbourne, we just say this is just an amazing city. So multicultural, there's social events. So there's definitely a target to get back there. From my perspective, from a retailer and a manufacturer, if I want to look ahead and say 2020 is booming, we're now working on our e-commerce, our website, our infrastructure. There's a lot of work and planning right now. We want to promote and push our local manufacturing. When you talked about the industries that are well known, the fashion industry actually used to be very, very prevalent here in Melbourne. The little Flinders Lane used to be full of fashion manufacturers. We have, unfortunately, a lot of all our production's gone offshore. Our company, it was a value of us to always keep a certain percentage back here with a local industry making our garments. So we have maintained about 50% of manufacturing here. So what we really want to do, my husband and I, is the vision is to increase that percentage and have high quality garments accredited with the Ethical Clothing Australia. So these are things we're working on. We're working on quality assurance, manufacturing and e-commerce. So when I look back and say 2020 is booming, it's because we've put the resources into improvements. So taking time to review and improve.
Thanks, Sharon.
Almost another panellist then.
That's right. Janine, your thoughts on how we might get to a booming 2030?
Yeah, a booming 2030, huh? Wouldn't that be great? So I think I try to think of this in terms of 3 pillars, right? So the first is what positive that we've learnt last year and this year. So what positives we're going to take out of our learnings, the adversity that we've experienced, and the recovery from that adversity. So that's the first one, is the positives, and I'll come back to it. The second is what negative legacies has 2020 left us with? And the third one is actually, where were we before all this happened? Because the best way to hide a small problem is to put it under a big problem, right? So once we've cleared away that big problem, what problems did we have? And we don't want to go back to where we were in 2019 with sluggish wage growth, with low productivity. A lot of people doing it hard. So I think on those three themes, I think there's something to learn from all three. So firstly, the positives. So I think actually Sharon and Paul have really covered those. The agility of business, the planning, the forward-looking of business. I think we really need to embrace what we've learnt about communication technology and take that forward into the future. And I think that's a real positive. On the negatives, two things. One is, quite rightly, we've got a lot of debt at the moment. So the government has quite rightly supported the household sector through this very difficult time, but we've got a legacy of a lot of debt. So my feeling is that it's not going to be the time for big tax cuts, even though those things have been announced. And the other negative, which I think is not too bad, right, is the scarring in the labour market. So, sometime throughout this year, essentially the labour market is going to need to absorb 2 years' worth of school leavers and graduates, whereas usually, they come in 1 year at a time. So, last year was very difficult for that cohort. So, but I think by 2030, that should all be dealt with. And I don't feel that there'll be really long-term scarring because we have actually come through this pretty quickly. So the unemployment rate's down just to 6.4%. Just even last October in the federal budget, that 6.5% or so was predicted for June 2022. And we're already there. We're really ahead of it. So I'm not too worried about that. And then back to where we were and what was going on before that. So sluggish wage growth. We had quite a regular every year, around 200,000 young people not in employment or education, just doing nothing. That's people aged below about 24. So where can we go with this? Well, I think one idea that I'm really excited about is an idea from Ross Garnaut, who wrote the Climate Change Review, about turning Australia into a low-carbon energy superpower. So the idea being that Australia has a real natural advantage in producing low-carbon energy, and we can then revive. You see, the thing is Australia once had, and Victoria in particular, once had a real natural advantage in producing cheap electricity from brown coal. And that really helped along the manufacturing sector. That really gave us a natural advantage. So it's about reviving that natural advantage, but doing it in a low carbon way. And the last point I'll make, is about the population. Right, so we have lost a fair bit of population growth at the moment. Commonwealth Government forecasted Victoria's population to reach 7 million by the middle of 2023. That's now going to be more like the end of 25. But we'll get there. It actually gives us a bit of breathing space. Gives us a bit of time to get our infrastructure right, address some of the problems we're having with congestion, particularly in the fast-growing west of Melbourne.
Thank you. So if you've just joined us again, you've joined the City of Melbourne Conversations series, where we're discussing the future of Melbourne's economy. We'll be coming to questions shortly, and if you have questions at home watching the live feed, you can email your questions to conversation@melbourne.vic.gov.au. I want to come back to the knowledge economy. I mean, much of the conversation about the impact of the city has been on the visitor economy, on the impact of foot traffic, but yet more than half of the City of Melbourne's economy is actually made up of the knowledge economy. It's financial, it's the finance sector, professional services, and sectors such as that, people working in big office towers. And yet, for decades and decades, we've seen the more knowledge-intensive work is, the more people want to come and work in central cities like this one, so they can catch up and collaborate and meet each other for coffee and go to business networking events. And the value of proximity and the value of being able to bump into each other face to face was really important. Yep, during the lockdown, we've discovered that everyone can do their work from home. Where do we find ourselves now in relation to the knowledge economy, and what do we do next?
We've actually got to blend the two. And whilst we did cope with working from home, let's not gloss over it. It wasn't ideal. Some parts worked. Certainly the saving of the city commute every day was an advantage, provided you put it into other areas. the ability to do email at home. It's been there for a while anyway. What we've done is created the possibility to do it. But what you missed, and what we missed, was that collaboration, that thinking, that learning by osmosis, particularly for those starting in new roles. We need to find a way to bring that back in, and ultimately the only way to do that is to do that face-to-face. I would still argue relationships are best developed face-to-face. They can be augmented over Zoom and other type of mediums, but they're best developed face-to-face. And I think that's what we'll see, a blending of a bit of work from home, a bit of work from the office. Now that actually might be 3 days at home, 2 days in the office. It might be actually 5 days in the office, but 10 till 2 to miss the peak hour commute, augmented by some other times of home. Every workplace will have a different requirement, a different allowance. If I talk to the investment banking community, they are banging the doors down. They're bumping that 75% already. If I talk to some other areas, they're probably struggling in the 50% back in the office. So I think it'll take some time. It'll take a bit of confidence to get there. But ultimately, there's two things that has to happen. We need leadership. So the business leaders in this city need to make it clear in terms of we want you back in the office. Right? Be flexible about it. And we need the employee to say, you know what, I do want to come back in and I do get some benefit out of being in the office as well.
Sharon or Janine, have you got any thoughts on the knowledge economy and what might that mean for cities, Janine? I mean, cities traditionally have been driven by the need to get together face to face.
Yeah, and I don't think that's going anywhere. I think we still need to get together face to face, but I don't think we need to. I think it's going to be more targeted and more organised. So rather than everybody just turning up 9 to 5, Monday to Friday, and then bumping into each other, we'll plan it a bit better. We'll plan that, you and I are going to be there on Wednesday and we'll bump into each other and
I'll look forward to it.
we'll plan to have a coffee, right? So I think this has actually implications for investment in commercial real estate. There's still a lot of building going up around Melbourne, and we may find that start to slow down. We may find that as the workforce just naturally grows, it'll be able to fit into the office space that we have because we won't be using it quite as much.
I actually think projecting in 12 to 24 months, you actually may have more numbers of people per day coming to the city. It might be shared spaces more, and as I said, it may not be one firm takes 40 floors, but you might actually broaden the number of people actually coming into the city. Not short term now. I do think that a lot of people who have enjoyed working at home due to family commitments or long travels, I think that's going to continue in a hybrid way. So what we may see is just more companies being in the city. But the real estate has to come down. The leases have to be more realistic.
Yeah, and I think on that real estate question, there's been some talk recently. I know PwC released a report a couple of weeks ago on lower lease costs, more vacant premises, both at vacant office space and vacant retail space, potentially presents an opportunity for creative and adaptive reuse of space to actually stimulate an exciting innovation-led resurgence in the economy. Do you see possibilities there in that type of thing, Paul?
Yeah, I do, and some of it's sort of back to the future a little bit. Sharon's already talked about the fashion industry, which used to dominate Flinders Lanes. If we think back to 20 years ago where living in the city was just introduced at that point in time, there'll be elements that we can learn from the past, and I love how you put it in terms of what were the positive, what were the negatives out of it. Ultimately, though, it's going to rely on the landlords of the city saying, well, I can't get the rents that I used to get, or I can and let them. If I can't, am I prepared to let the shop sit vacant or the building sit vacant, or am I prepared to lower the take to get somebody in there? And that's classic supply and demand. It'll sort itself out. It'll be a bit bumpy, but I think it will sort itself out. The stimulus has to come from the imagination. We've got great leaders in the city. Yourself, I saw Louise here before. Justin Haney's relatively new to the city as well. A new council as well with a vibrant Lord Mayor. We have enough leaders here. We have a state government that's committed to making sure that the city rebounds as well. And I have to say, you have a wonderful industry that sits both within the city and around the city wanting to make it work as well. So I think we'll figure it out. I think we should take our time to figure it out, because I think we are in the period of disruptive change. Some of us were expecting, most of us weren't expecting the level of disruptive change that we're experiencing.
One of the things that I'm hearing around the city is that some industries and some sectors have actually been booming during the pandemic. You think like sectors such as the biotechnology and medical technology sector, medical supplies, the digital and ICT sectors, particularly supplying everything associated with the work from home and other digital transformation that's happening in the city. There are parts of the economy that seem to have really done quite well. What else are you hearing? All of you.
Yeah, I think with those sorts of things, it's a matter of understanding what's transitory and what's permanent. So I think that booming that we're seeing in the medical sector and so forth, that's a direct consequence of the situation that we're in with COVID. And, it may be that we have a lasting legacy of better hygiene practices, more hand sanitising and mask wearing. But I think the real spike that we've seen is a spike and won't last. Whereas I think possibly with the digital technology, I think we've got a real shift to embracing that sort of technology. Those technologies have been around for a time. What we saw last year, I think, was quite important cultural change in terms of embracing that sort of technology. So, for example, my father learned how to use email for the first time. So I think there's been real change there. I think collaboration, people working together, working from home. In my workplace, at least, we became much more comfortable with just ringing each other any time of day, whereas, perhaps once upon a time, if someone was working at home, you'd leave them alone. So I think there's been some real cultural change that has actually brought some of that technology to life, and I think that's here to stay.
And Sharon? Sorry, we'll come back to you, Paul.
Absolutely, the e-commerce side of things. Our retail stores catering for a mature ladies or ladies from 60 years on, who many could not use the website. We had a 300% increase in our online sales in the last 12 months. I mean, people were forced to, if they wanted to buy something, and for 3 months Melbourne was in lockdown, they had to learn how to use it. And I think that has now made it a pathway for a lot of people that said, no, I won't go online. But I mean, it'll be a blend. There'll be times when people want quick, efficient, I'm time poor, I'm going to go online and order it. And then there's going to be times where, no, I want to go and look at the fabric, I want to feel it, touch it. So I really feel strongly that we need to get both right. We need to get our footprint in bricks and mortar right. It doesn't have to be a massive footprint. We don't have to have 150 stores, but we have to have good contributing stores backed by a really fantastic e-commerce system. And that's not easy. We changed our website exactly when the pandemic hit, not intentionally, but it was just an 18-month project, and we're still having issues with it. So that's one of our biggest improvements. We need to keep working on it, but I absolutely think that is a game changer. More people are used to ordering online.
Paul, you had something else to add?
Yeah, I'm actually optimistic about the future. Yeah, we've come out of this really well. We've come out of it actually better than any other economy in the world. And we've done it in a shorter period of time. And we've come out of it without the level of deaths that were predicted at the start of this. So if I go back 12 months and 2 days ago, the prediction was, at worst case, 150,000 deaths as a result of COVID. We're nowhere near that. Right? So we've navigated this well. we've already talked about what the shape of the economy was going to be from an unemployment perspective. We're well ahead of that already. We're a good 12 months ahead of that as well. The debt levels are up from a government perspective, fully understand that, but household savings up at a different level as well. We're well positioned to rebound and rebound strongly because the foundations of our city are in place. We have the best education sector anywhere in the world. I'd challenge anyone to line up the university sector that we have and compete with it anywhere in the world. Our manufacturing base got tested, put to work. People like Sharon have produced things that they didn't produce in the past. We flipped and actually manufactured ventilators at different parts of the state as well. I could go on. Pretty much every part of our economy, except those 5 areas that I talked about, actually got through this very well. We are set up. That doesn't mean there won't be bumps, because there will be. Particularly over the next couple of months as JobKeeper comes off. But if we allow the negativity to overrule the ambition, we won't get anywhere. We have to start setting the planning so that we can continue the growth that we had just up to 12 months ago.
So I'm interested in turning this conversation a little bit to how we organise ourselves going into the future. We've obviously got government plays a really important role. We've got 3 levels of government. You've got the federal government that's clearly been leading on things such as JobKeeper and JobSeeker and tax and other tax settings, etc. And we'll have into the future. We saw that today through the tourism package. We've got the state government, which is led through support for landlords and offering discounted leases on premises and a range of other stimulus interventions, and then a city government like the City of Melbourne, who plays a really important role in activating the city and working with stakeholders in the city. Then clearly you've got the industries themselves, businesses, industry associations, universities, a whole bunch of other people that all need to be a part of that conversation about recovery. What's the best way of organising ourselves to ensure that we're actually not operating at cross purposes and that we're actually all pointing our noses in the same direction? Any thoughts on how we might go about that?
Want me to go? Yeah. I think what we learnt through last year, and we've known it's been there, but we really haven't utilised the opportunity, at least through the last 5 or 10 years, is this spirit of cooperation. Yeah. Yet it's in our DNA as Australians. Look after your mate, right? Is part of that collaboration. That is something that if we can grab and take forward, we'll be in good shape. You've got to reflect on some of the decisions that were made over the past 12 months, and they should be studied and they should be celebrated. Closing the borders when the federal government did in mid-March was genius, right? JobKeeper was genius because it got people out of the unemployment queues and actually helped them stay connected to their workplace. From a state government perspective, the business grants and the mentoring program and some of the other subsidies that were put in place were genius. These were all done in very quick succession. The opportunity as we come out of this really comes now down to the 3rd level of government, as you talk about. What does the City of Melbourne do? What do the other cities do to help stimulate that? Bringing the key people together will be a start of it, and that's ultimately what we're doing with the Victoria Summit. It's not a Victorian Chamber or Vecchi piece, it's actually a Victorian piece. And we've collaborated, Trades Hall, for example, will be part of that steering committee, and we've collaborated with Trades Hall over the past 12 months. People go, how does business and unions actually come together and stand together? Well, it's quite simple. We all want jobs. And the only way to have jobs is to have healthy businesses. So we're there supporting businesses and workers. Trade union is there supporting workers as well. So it's drop the barriers. Let's work out what the greater good is. Come together to come up with those ideas. I don't believe there's any mortgage on good ideas. And the more good ideas that we can get out there with the incentive to bring those to life is the best way to take this forward.
Janine?
Yeah, it sounds to me like industry and business is in good hands, Paul. And I think, industry has a profit motive. Industry will adapt and pick up well. I think the much more challenging issue actually is, as you say, what does the City of Melbourne do? So the City of Melbourne should act to facilitate industry operating smoothly. It should act in the interests of its citizens. Melbourne faces a challenge. I think there's no doubt about that. I've been sitting here facing these empty shop fronts for the last half hour. But Melbourne is a marvellous piece of infrastructure that sits in the middle of 4 million people. Right, so even if it's not office workers and foot traffic that Melbourne is catering to anymore, Melbourne still has its residents, it still has an awful lot of wonderful entertainment infrastructure, so for the arts, for the sports, it's got great transport infrastructure that brings people into the city. So Melbourne must continue to support those things and continue to make the most of the infrastructure that is here.
Thanks. And Sharon, have you got...
So the only extra I could add would be that when you're having these summits, that there's a strong retail presence on the committees, because, you have a look at every street here, there is shop fronts. So as much as there's a lot of office buildings, you really do want to, whether it's restaurants, retail, travel agents, you really do need spokespeople in the retail to come to work out what's the best way to incentivise people coming in and spending money. So it's a hard one, really, from a retail perspective, because customers don't have to come into the city if there's what they believe no reason to. But I mean, when we sit here and looking at all the people walking past, it is encouraging, especially when you think 3 weeks to the day we were all in lockdown. And as you said, week by week there are more people, but I think there has to be still a lot done for retail to survive, well and truly survive here.
I want to come back to a different focus now. The City of Melbourne is not just the CBD.
Yeah.
There are lots of different parts of the CBD, all parts of the City of Melbourne, all of which are experiencing this period differently. There's Docklands, for example, which relies heavily on office workers and visitors and residents, and it's been particularly challenged during this period. The South Bank, you've got Fisherman's Bend, a growth opportunity in advanced manufacturing. Arden with a new with a new metro tunnel. There are all sorts of different things happening in different parts of this city. Some of them represent fantastic opportunities for growth over the medium term. And I'm interested in your reflections on how we might begin to think about the city in a rich, multi-layered way, even beyond the CBD potentially.
Yeah, it is actually a great question. I think it starts by getting what can get back to some type of normality back there as quick as we can. And when I say that, if I look at the showgrounds, Flemington Precinct, it'd be great to see events come to life there. Equally, it'd be great to see events come to life again at the Arts Centre, at the Melbourne Convention and Exhibition Centre, the Sydney Mire Music Bowl, down Melbourne Olympic Park. That gives us some level of normality, and that's achievable in the short term. That then spills into hospitality and retail are coming back to life as the theatre districts come back to life as well. So I think as soon as we can get them moving, get the city-based workers back in, it gives us a platform to say, okay, that's the type of normality that we've got for now. Let's live with that and plan around that. Then to the wider precincts in terms of what do we need? Because what we needed 12 months ago has probably changed. As people have worked out, they can live in regional Victoria and actually commute back in to the CBD. It gives an opportunity to really think through what do we need from those precincts that haven't been developed or haven't had a shovel in the ground just yet, to rethink and say, maybe there's a different way through this. But I think it starts with let's getting what we can going as quickly as we can, and then as we're doing that, start planning for the other precincts to come to life as well.
Thank you. Janine?
Yeah, very much a matter of what do we have in place so far and how do we use it to the best effect, and what have we not done yet that we can still make a difference to. So, the all that office space down at Docklands, that's pretty much well developed and it's in place. And with the new changes to the way we communicate and so forth, and possibly less office work, it's possible that those spaces will struggle over the next 10 years. But natural growth will eventually catch up and fill those spaces again. I think it's time for a bit of a pause on building any more. Around the Fisherman's Bend area and the sort of manufacturing capability and infrastructure that we may be able to build there, as I mentioned before, transitioning into a low carbon superpower could present a real synergy with developing really advanced manufacturing capability there. As I said before, Victoria's previous strength in manufacturing was built on cheap electricity.
Yeah. So, and Sharon, have you got any thoughts?
The only thing I'd say is there were some issues with retail already. I mean, we can't just say COVID's caused us to have empty shop fronts. If you came here 12 months ago, over the years there have been more and more empty shop fronts, but you sort of want to then challenge, Chapel Street. I know it's outside the city of Melbourne, but that used to be South Yarra, Chapel Street, Toorak Road. They used to be very thriving retail precincts, even Richmond. So I think there are deeper issues as well that we as retailers have to work out why. So it's a hard question.
Right, we've got one last quick question before we go to Q&A. So if you're in the audience, get your questions ready. And for those of you at home, you can pose your question by emailing conversations@melbourne.vic.gov.au or post them on the YouTube live feed. So one last question. What are you optimistic about? What makes you optimistic about the future of Melbourne? Janine, we'll start with you.
Well, actually, Paul and Sharon have made me feel quite optimistic about the capability of industry to really adapt to all challenges that have been thrown their way. Another thing that makes me really optimistic is actually how well Melburnians handled the lockdowns. Yeah. We were a bit grumpy, we complained, but we put on our masks and we obeyed the rules to a large extent, and we got through COVID with relatively few deaths and relatively few cases. That makes me really optimistic about the spirit of Melbourne and the way that we will pull together when we need to. And from a more economic perspective, I think what that means is that Melbourne's brand and Australia's brand, we already had that sort of brand as safe and clean, but I think that's really been reinforced. The rest of the world is, even when the vaccination comes, there's so much COVID out there that the vaccination isn't really going to be as effective as it will be here, where we've got very, very low levels of COVID. The vaccination will really be able to stamp it out. So this makes me really optimistic, those two things.
Yeah, thank you. And Sharon?
We're quietly optimistic. We're still cautious, but what excites us is hearing our customers come into the retail stores. They're wanting to come out. They've got events. I mean, for a whole year there was no engagements, weddings, conferences, race day events. So they're excited about events happening now in Melbourne. So that's exciting. It's exciting to see that there's customer confidence. But I also think through this there has been a lot of collaboration, a lot of people helping each other. It was fantastic to see Melbourne community working together. When there was health workers in strife, we all as a community in the industry, there were a lot of volunteer groups getting together and making masks for people. So to me that's very optimistic that we are a great group of people, industries, and I can see a lot of positives that's come out, especially in the collaboration.
Thank you. And Paul?
I love this city, and I think we're in really good hands. We've got a great group of citizens that banded together last year. Then we've got some wonderful leaders around. I think the City of Melbourne is in really good hands from a leadership perspective. I think the state government really understands what needs to be done in the city, is supportive of it, and the federal government really understands what needs to be done for the city and supportive of it as well. When I look around the city, go and see Harry Potter in any other city in Australia. You can't. Go and throw 100,000 people in a stadium, watch a footy match. You can't. Go and watch world-class sport anywhere across this state in any other city. You can't. And it goes on. Go and have one of the best meals you'll ever have at one of our great city restaurants anywhere else in Australia. You can't. We've got it here. We've built it. Go and rival our education sector anywhere else, not only Australia but the world. You can't. And then while you're out there, go and drop into the Parkville precinct where medtech is booming, research is booming, and put that up against anywhere else in Australia or the world. You can't. Right? We have some wonderful assets. We're starting to understand them and appreciate them even more than what we have in the past. Great citizens. We've got some wonderful businesses here. When I look at Seek, Victorian, Melbourne. Car sales, Victorian, Melbourne. I could go on. We've got some wonderful business, wonderful leaders. We're in great shape to rebound here.
Fantastic. You wouldn't want to be anywhere else in the world at the moment, I think.
Couldn't agree more.
I was out last night. I saw Come From Away at the Comedy Theatre and after dinner in Chinatown, and one of those classic Melbourne experiences, and it was magnificent. And I think what an amazing city we have. Now we are ready for questions. So in the audience, we'd love to see your questions if you've got them. If not, we'll. There we do have some hands. So can we get some microphones, please, to the? There we are. Great. Thank you.
Hi, thanks so much for your presentations. One trend that always seems to happen is when there's a crisis, marginalized communities get hit the hardest. And Janine, you talked about, let's also think about what are problems that existed before. And then there was also a lot of discussion about collaboration. So my question is, how, when we're collaborating to plan for the future, do we make sure that marginalized voices get included? I'm thinking, for example, about how I see more and more vendors moving to cashless payments, and there are obvious groups that don't have access to credit. Yeah, that's the question.
That's an excellent question. Thank you. Who would like to take that one?
Okay. Yeah, great question. Really, really great question. So before you asked about what the City of Melbourne could do, and I think, every level of government has a role to play in helping marginalised communities come to the table, giving them what they need. One thing that was sort of considered normal before the pandemic, in fact considered pretty good, was an unemployment rate of 5%. I think what we've learned during the pandemic, and even before it, we were seeing it in the US, is that unemployment can go lower than that. And I think that's really, really important and really key to helping people out of poverty. So the thing is that government's always a bit cautious about stimulating the economy because they fear inflation. Right, so once unemployment's down to sort of 5%, they think we shouldn't pump any more money into the economy because it'll just cause inflation. But I think it's become clear that they could pump more money into the economy and reduce unemployment to perhaps 4 or even 3%. And that lifts people out of poverty, and it helps connect people in communities. It helps connect them with other people and with the rest of Australia. So that's one thing. Another thing is our training system. So I think it's really important that we're giving the right sort of education and training opportunities to all young people. So there's been a pretty much ongoing trend of around 200,000 people, young people that are not in education or training. Why is that? And what can we do to reach out to those people? Training needs to keep up with what industry needs. So there needs to be ongoing collaboration between vocational education and training and industry. I think that's a really, really important conversation that needs to be had.
Thank you.
The only question I've got is, it's very, I've got a question too. It's very geared towards young people, let alone doesn't seem to be any apprenticeships or incentives for sort of middle-aged to older people who may now be out of jobs. So that's, my question.
There is actually some federal government programs that addresses exactly that.
Okay.
So people, who have been dislodged from their industry, wanting to find work in new industries. So it's there. We've seen a growth in apprentice numbers, so new entrants at levels that we haven't seen
in
before.
The older age group?
In both, the older and younger age group. It's actually curious that we may end up with what will be not so high unemployment right now, but underemployment in some skilled sectors as well. So there's opportunities that open up if we're prepared to go back and retrain into those areas that we imported people to do those jobs before, because they can't get back in under COVID. But back to the those communities that were asked about, join the conversation. I don't think there's any better time than now to let your voice be heard, because as part of the regrouping for the city and the state, the multicultural voice is important. We are a multicultural city, more so than any other city in Australia and probably the world. We've done it okay. We can always do it better. COVID hasn't solved those problems, but I think COVID has actually created a bit more of a conscience around what else can we do to make this city great.
Thank you. Next question, I think, was over here.
Thanks, everybody. I'm just curious. I've had the fortune of travelling interstate the last couple of months. I was up in Sydney, and I don't want to start a Sydney-Melbourne thing, but I might anyway. A city that only went through one lockdown. There's a lot more confidence. The event I was at was indoors with 300 people and food, and I think I'd love to get back to those kind of events in Melbourne. But one of the things that they spoke about was thinking big, and perhaps are we in danger of thinking too small about what Melbourne looks like after this? We're in a region that's one of the fastest growing regions in the world, and when you look at comparative cities, we're still going to be right in the top 2 or 3 at the other end of this. Are we doing enough? Are we thinking big enough?
It's a really great question, and it's why the Victoria Summit that I've talked about sits there, because that is designed to think a bigger picture. Where can Victoria truly lead globally in 5, 6, 7 different sectors? Whether it be renewable energy, whether it be some of the commercialisation of IP that sits in the university side, and then where do we look to in 2 decades, and where do we look to in 3 decades? So by 2050, where is Victoria positioned, and as a result, where is Melbourne positioned as part of that as well? There's another program called the Grid, which is looking specifically at a Melbourne piece in terms of where it can look. But your challenge is an important one. If we choose to look low, that's where we'll end up. There's an old saying, shoot for the stars, and you might hit the moon. It's not a bad outcome. And that's, as leaders, and your voice will be important to it, where do we want to take this city? Because we don't just want to leave debt for the next generation through. We have to leave hope and ambition and realistic plans for them to not only remove that debt, but to have prosperity into the future as well.
Now that might be a fantastic note to finish on. I think we're at time and we need to move to reopen the streets to allow people back down Little Collins Street. What a fantastic event it's been. It's great to be back in the city in real life and meeting face to face and having these conversations. So to those of you who made it along in person today, thank you. For those of you watching at home, thank you. If you're at home, don't forget to subscribe to the Melbourne Knowledge Week YouTube channel to stay up to date with Melbourne Conversations events. And there's also a link in the video description to a survey which will be sent out to any of you, any ticket holders present here today. And the City of Melbourne team would love to hear your thoughts on this event, what worked well and what we can improve upon. So on that note, thank you very, very much. And we look forward to seeing you back in Melbourne very soon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.